Hey everybody, welcome to Talking in Common. This is Aaron Silverberg, and I'm the co-creator of Common Lands Associated Media. The entire intention of this channel, of this series of episodes, is not just to celebrate Dungeons and Dragons and those of us that have already enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons, but rather it's to bring people together.
Come together!
Not all that long ago, I was a new D&D player, and I think that falling in love with Dungeons & Dragons as an adult is a totally different experience than if you fall in love with it as an adolescent. So this episode is dedicated to why D&D? Why should you be involved in it? Why should you take an interest? Why should you take that invitation, if you've never played before, to maybe hop in and play at somebody's table? And the first thing that I think might be very off-putting to people is, well, one, it's just kind of the fantasy genre. So you typically have a demographic of people that are into that kind of stuff, and then if that's not necessarily your demographic, you might have an initial hurdle. Another thing is I often hear everybody saying, I don't know how to play. I wouldn't know what to do. And to me, I completely understand that thought. It's the feeling that a lot of people have towards anything they've never done before. I want to bring this back to why D&D, and I think that everybody could share their own reason. But it really comes down to these central components of social connection and artistic expression. Now, for me, from my perspective as a history teacher, those things are integral parts of human civilization. We're social creatures. We have to be connected with each other. We have to have structure to make sure that we're like healthy beings in healthy societies. And from the earliest civilizations, we've seen that artistic expression is a major part of not just the individual human experience, but the collective human experience. And so all of these things in a premeditated, planned, intentional forum are healthy for the soul. When I first was invited to play Dungeons and Dragons, I remember being like, maybe not. This sounds like it's going to be several hours of playing this game that I don't know how to play. And I'm like, all right, whatever. This is a different group of people. I might as well hang out with them. And then I remember my friend says, hey, let's meet up for lunch and design your character. And immediately I could see where some other people might be turned off. Playing video games, board games, even going out and playing sports, you have a little bit more of immediate gratification. So with Dungeons & Dragons, the first thing you have to do before you even play the game is you have to have a created character. And that takes work. So another deterrent to getting into the game is the work it actually takes, because there are actual tasks that need to be accomplished. And again, the gratification is not as instantaneous as it might be in modern 2020 gaming world, etc. So those are all things that you want to keep in mind. Okay, if you want to understand this world, if you want to get engaged in this world, you're going to have to do a little bit of thought and planning, but the payoff is worth it, because when you come into the game, you've filled out what are my ideals, what are my motivations?
What's my motivation?
What are my strengths and weaknesses? What are my best skills?
I don't even have any good skills.
What gear have I equipped myself with? You have a character that is ready to play a completely interactive game in a world that has limitless options, truly limitless. And again, I always like to compare Dungeons and Dragons to those kind of storytelling video games. If you've ever played those video games and you feel like, oh, this is so cool, I get to be like in the movie. But then you realize at the end of the video game, it doesn't really matter what you picked. It was basically just going to end up the way that it was. Or what D&D folks might say, the story was on rails. That this was going to go one way regardless.
Oh, no!
If you can get lost in the open world choice of those video games or any fantasy imaginary experience, that is a really magical thing, because again, then you start to create things. You start to create premises. You start to create meaning out of the story or the experience that the designer didn't actually come up with. It was you. And again, that's very different than most other games I've ever come across. The other piece of it is obviously just, you're hanging with friends. Whether this be people that you've had great relationships with and this is your excuse to just get to see people, or maybe making friends isn't the easiest thing for you, or just being around people isn't the easiest thing for you. Well, Dungeons & Dragons is a platform for that. It is a platform to bring people together that want to play this game that might not ever come together under ordinary circumstances. So I was just a little bit ago speaking of my first ever Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and I remember the friend that drew me into that. He was the dungeon master of that campaign. A friend of his, whom I'd never met before, we decided in our first meeting of this campaign, the first episode, that, well, there's this really, really rich entrepreneur in the town. We defeated him, and instead of just going on and killing a bunch of people, we're both kind of like, our fantasy is running a business. So I remember this guy and I ended up meeting at Chipotle the following week on a Wednesday for lunch, just to kind of come up with our little business plan in the game of Dungeons & Dragons, both of us newcomers. And that was a really cool thing. I'm meeting up for a business lunch for the business we just took over in this fantasy world. And again, this is a guy that I'd probably, I don't know, never hang out with if it weren't for D&D. And here we are meeting up for lunch after one time meeting each other. The other thing is just, again, as you get older, I'm only 32, but if you can see closely, I already got the gray hairs coming in. And you get older and, life is harder. Life is there's a ton of things that fill up your life, especially during COVID. Making Dungeons & Dragons happen is a commitment. It's an achievement, and having that thing that anchors you. It's like holidays. It's like many other social structures. You need to have kind of a social gel and structure and purpose to even get together. And Dungeons & Dragons is another thing that really brings you together for, something to work on, not just to sit here and exist in a room. And I think that for many people, myself included, although I think I might be somewhat socially adept, I struggle too. Really struggled with small talk. Well, it's great to be able to do small talk in a fantasy world, but also you don't have to do the fantasy talk. The small talk in a fantasy world. You can just kind of get right to business. There are important things to take care of when you are the heroes of an adventure. So I really appreciate being able to have something to do when I'm around other people, when ordinarily, if we don't have a task, it might create a lot of anxiety for me. The central thing that I've really loved about Dungeons & Dragons, and I think it's why I've invested myself in our young company, Common Lands Associated Media, is Dungeons & Dragons is a unbelievable creative hub for art. I know that just in my few years of playing, since I've been indoctrinated into the Dungeons & Dragons way of being, I've started taking on not just background stories, which everybody writes, but political legislation, city planning. I think you can see behind me I got a few instruments. I brought music and songwriting into our campaigns. Poetry. All of these things that might not necessarily have a purpose or anybody that's like really interested in checking them out, unless you're like super talented and most of us are just kind of middle of the road. All of a sudden they have an audience. They have a purpose and a reason for sharing with other people. That's really, really important to me. My favorite way to doodle in class my entire life, granted I was never an artist really, but was to make just maps. All right, here's bodies of water, here's land masses, and here's geographical variation, here's the vegetation, etc., whatever. And then I would just kind of imagine here, instead of what other content I'm supposed to be learning in class, all of the different maybe tribal or somewhat complex social systems that exist in these fantastical lands that I've made in my my fantasy map here in class. And so, again, that skill that I'd actually been refining throughout most of my former years has kind of come back and been a really, really strong dungeon master skill, even though I've never really considered myself a strong artist. So all of those things are really, really meaningful. And again, I come back to this idea of being an adult and not necessarily always having the joy of not just like beating down monsters and just like being with your friends and being like a kid, you know, but like also just that younger spirit that I had maybe when I was like right after high school, college age, you know, where I wanted to just be an artist in every way possible. And nowadays, you know, you finish your work day and it's just like, okay, well, I'd like to go home and have dinner and, you know, take the work pants off and just kind of lay in the bed and cuddle the dog in situation.
Don't you hate pants?
So, you know, having something that kind of drives you to tap into that part of yourself that you feel like might have been drifting away is a really, really, really nice thing to have in your life. If you're having a hard time getting involved, check out some of the products at Commonlands Associated Media, thecommonlands.com. Take care, guys. See you next time.
He has come to take the city by storm because he cares about making things fair. So Dr. Weaver, beware. The demon